Sometimes people talk about stone wall construction being like putting together a puzzle, which is a decent analogy, except with the puzzle, like you have pieces that you know go together. It's usually only two-dimensional. So here we're dealing with like 3 dimensions and irregular, misshapen pieces that don't necessarily fit. So if you are on a site where you already have stone to begin to build with, you're going to have the luxury of not needing to haul in materials, but knowing where you're building and what exactly you're building obviously precedes the construction part. So if you can move things in a way that it makes your life easier when you move them again, and hopefully not again and again, what I would do is, first off, if I know that I want to build a wall where this wall is existing, I want to leave myself a good alley so that I have like easy and clear access and I'm not tripping over stones. I can see where I'm working. So we want to give ourselves at least probably a 3-foot alley here. A few years ago, I was watching some guys working on a job, and they had this really brilliant way of arranging their stones that they had, instead of just having like a big pile strewn about, they kind of set things up in a way that you could actually like see each stone in an organized way. And it was almost like a little stone library, like there's many different types of stone that you'll like end up building with. In some places, people are working with more like cobbles, like glacial stone that's really rounded, which some of the patterns that I'm going to talk about here are going to be very different than what you would ultimately be applying if you're working with that glacial stuff, just because you don't have flat planes to lay things down, to lay each course down on top of. But like if I look at this stone here, there are sort of 2 parallel flat faces. And so that is a big plus if it's pretty parallel and flat. So that's one thing I'm looking for, like flat parallel faces. And so like you can see here, right, we've got a nice flat top. I don't know what the bottom looks like, but this one's nice and flat. So if that's the type of aesthetic you're looking for, if that's the type of material that you're looking for, you're really going to want to prioritize those stones, because again, it makes it that much easier to set them on top of one another in a way that they're solid and they don't rock. You also want it to look nice, and that is a very subjective thing. But the face of the stone that the side of the stone that's actually showing and visible is something that's for you to determine. I tend to believe that there's a certain face that looks right, or it looks good, and there are faces that don't necessarily look so good. So like when I look at this stone, that face here, to me, looks like it could be an exterior face that you would be like presenting. That could be as well, possibly. But usually what you want is that face has a bevel that runs back, so that if you imagine as you build this wall up, it's got a batter that kicks it back into, either if it's a freestanding wall, back into itself, or if it's a retaining wall, like back into the material it's retaining. If that's, like this stone here has a little bit of that batter built back into it. If we had it flipped like that, so it's cantilevered out into space, there's something about that to me that just doesn't look right. And structurally, it's not ideal, because it's inviting you to start to, unless there's a reason why you want to cantilever your wall, if you're continuing that plane, it's inviting you to start to hang out into space. So what I'm getting at is that the stone tells you a lot about where it could fit because of the shape of the face of each individual. As I'm looking at stones and setting them to the side, I'm already trying to like place them in a way where I'm like, okay, well that's the face that I like best. So that's the side I'm going to work with. So now when I come back to my little quiver of stones here, I'm not just looking at a pile, I'm seeing how I imagine that stone might fit in the wall. In this case, this would be my personal preference for building. Try to avoid the stuff that's like really irregular, because you can work with it, but like that sort of stone is going to be pretty difficult to find a good place for, where it's able to support more stones on top of it. I found that this, like laying things out like this, is really nice, because it's kind of like now you can just go and look and see, and you've already moved stuff, you've already thought about that stone, and just having spent a little bit of time with the stones beforehand helps you like build sort of an inventory of what materials you have to work with. A lot of the stone walls I've built were stone retaining walls for like, terraces and things like that. And the approach to building a terrace or a retaining wall is going to be different than what you would do if you're building like a foundation wall, like a freestanding stone wall. Because in that case, if you're building a foundation, you're building a wall with two faces that are exposed. Whereas with a retaining wall, like let's say this is a retaining wall and we're going to backfill with soil behind it. We're only seeing this face. What happens on the inside of the wall, on the interior of the wall, no one's ever going to see. So it's very important structurally, but aesthetically it doesn't matter at all. So that's a great opportunity to make use of all those irregular stones, the ones that are really hard to fit together. Most likely you won't find more than a third of the total volume of stones that you've got that really could like kind of make it as face stones if you're being picky about your aesthetic. And so that becomes a real sort of challenge if you're building a wall with two faces. Normally you'll pick one, like the exterior is the one that you're trying to make really nice. Like we just built this wall right on the ground. And in some applications that could be fine. But normally what I would advise is that you dig out a trench equal to the width of the wall you'll be building and about 12 to 18 inches in depth, that you line with a geotextile fabric, like a filter fabric. But at the very least, I would scrape off your topsoil because the topsoil is too valuable to just be burying with stone in the first place. And secondly, it's not a good structural base. Probably 4 to 12 inches is what you'd need to remove. And then try to compact what's underneath it, like with a hand tamper or just jumping up and down on it. Something to make sure that your base is really nice and stable. And then if you have gravel, fill that cavity in with gravel to create a drainage plane. We know that things are going to shift as the ground freezes and thaws in the spring, providing better drainage, especially like on a site like this where you could actually have the trench just like pitched to a point where it just kind of opens up to daylight, we'd say. All the water that accumulates in that gravel-filled trench just gets sent out to the lowest point. This first course, especially if you've got gravel laid down, is really important because it's your opportunity to use things like this that have no or very little opportunity to fit into the wall somewhere else, but they're big and they take up space. This stone still might not really fit in this wall, but it's that first course is the chance to use up the stones that have one face that's pretty, or one surface that's pretty nice and flat, and then one that's really irregular. That's another reason why it's valuable to take the time to like inventory what you've got, because you don't want to use like a perfect capstone, one that's like dead flat that's gonna like span a bunch of stones on the top of your wall just in the base right away. As a general rule, if you're building a retaining wall, what I learned was for every foot of height for your wall, your base should be equal in depth, in thickness. So if your wall's a foot high, you want to be about a foot wide. If your wall's 2 feet high, about 2 feet wide. It might be 4 feet at the base, but as you build up the inside wall, the buried part of the wall, is getting narrower and narrower. And if you know the rules, then you're in a decent place to break the rules. So you might not actually build a 4 foot wide base if your wall's 4 feet high, but you know that you want a really wide, stable base the higher that you go. So people have probably heard like the cornerstone, that's a metaphor that we use a lot. So the cornerstones are really important because they stitch and hold together the ends of the wall. And so what you're looking for in a cornerstone usually is something that's pretty substantial and something that has a nice right angle in it. And it's amazing how hard it is to find a good right angle. And even if you're building with round stones, you need cornerstones when you get to the corners. Those cornerstones, stones that have a nice right angle and that are fairly substantial, want to get set off in a special spot so that they don't just accidentally get like buried in the wall. And I haven't found a lot of great cornerstones in our pile here, but this one I do really like. And often starting from the corner makes a lot of sense because you work from the corners and then build your way in. Instead of just building across in like horizontal courses, you build up the corners and then you kind of fill in the space so that you always have all these options for where the next stone's going to fit. You're looking for like the base stones, the big, heavy, chunky stones that like are irregular at the bottom. Like this one looks like it could be a good base stone. In that it's not too bad on the bottom side, but it's not super flat. The first course is a great time to lose this stone because you're gonna not have to worry about finding something that sits flat on that later on. Then there would be like face stones, which we already talked about, stones that have a nice, regular face that you could see being exposed in the wall. Let's say it's 2 feet wide and I'm just building on top of an existing base. It's not enough to just build something like this where you've got these 2 separate wall planes that are going on. Every so often, it's really important that you have a stone that spans those, that ties those walls together. Tie stones span across the wall so they stitch it together. And then last would be the capstones. So to stitch the whole wall together and make it look nice, ideally you've got some big stones, and you might not, but especially if it's like a sitting wall or something, stones that like cap off the entirety of the wall and really hold it together. Those you may or may not find, but that might be where, here, like this stone might be one of my best capstones that I'd end up with. And so that is now helping hold that together and keep it from just being a bunch of loose stones on the top surface.